In this lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about economies of scale, which refers to a situation where the per unit costs either go up or go down with the level of output. And just to put this in context a little bit, remember that anytime we're talking about a pricing decisions focus on comparing marginal revenues and marginal costs. The marginal revenue side of that equation deals with or is influenced by price levels and consumer demand. The focus of this lecture is really on the other side of that, the marginal cost side of that, and looking at instances where the marginal cost of producing a particular product may actually go up or may go down based on or depending on the level of output. So I'd like to talk first about or define the law of diminishing marginal returns, which simply states that as a firm tries to expand output, the marginal productivity will eventually decline, and as a result, the marginal cost of production will eventually begin to rise. Increasing marginal costs will eventually cause an increase in the overall average costs of production for the firm. This can make it a little bit more complicated to compute not only break-even prices, but profit-maximizing prices as well. Another key idea or takeaway point is that anytime you're negotiating a contract, it's very important to know what your cost curves look like. Otherwise, you may end up accepting contracts or prices at levels that are simply unprofitable. Now, if the average cost falls with output, then economists refer to this situation as one of increasing returns to scale. In this case, a firm wants to focus on strategies that really secure sales that enable them to realize those lower costs. So when we talk about increasing returns to scale, the return there is kind of the opposite of cost. So increasing returns to scale really mean that my incremental costs are going down and there's a benefit to increasing my scale. On the other hand, if one offers a supplier large orders or big orders that enable them to realize the economies of scale and lower their production costs, then it may be to that, say, retailer's advantage to try to share in their profit by demanding lower prices. This is a strategy that Walmart has almost nearly perfected, as it offers its suppliers large quantities of consumer demand, but in response demands lower prices from their suppliers and shares in that profit in the form of lower prices. Now, if average costs are constant with respect to output, then economists refer to this as constant returns to scale. If the average costs rise with levels of output, then economists refer to this as decreasing returns to scale or diseconomies of scale, and that is associated with increasing incremental or marginal costs. Learning curves refer to production situations in which the current production actually lowers future costs. In instances with learning curves, it's very important to look over the life cycle of the product when determining pricing decisions, when making pricing decisions, or negotiating contracts with suppliers. If the cost of producing two outputs is actually jointly less than the cost of producing them separately, then there is a situation that economists refer to as economies of scope. The scope of the production or the number of products being produced actually has an influence on the cost. This can be an important source of a competitive advantage and can also shape and be a motivation, a legitimate motivation for acquisition or merger strategies between competing or rival firms. Now, the law of diminishing marginal returns states that as you expand output, eventually marginal productivity will decline. Diminishing marginal returns mean that marginal productivity declines, and diminishing marginal productivity means increasing marginal costs. These increasing marginal costs will then eventually lead to increasing average costs. What are some of the causes economically of diminishing marginal returns? Well, we could ask the question, why is it the case that Ford Motor Company might get to a point where it costs them more to produce cars? Well, it's difficult monitoring a large and motivating a large workforce. Okay? That would be one reason or one factor that might tend to push costs in the direction of increasing marginal costs. An increasingly complex production system just becomes inherently more difficult to manage. At some point, that might lead to increasing marginal costs. And then the idea of the fixity of some factor, like testing capacity, might just simply, there might just be a ceiling above which you just can't scale up beyond without incurring some real serious costs. This graph illustrates the idea of marginal costs. The left-hand side of the cost curve here illustrates the increasing marginal returns and therefore decreasing marginal costs. So costs are going down, and then at some point the costs begin to go up, and that right-hand side of the curve is what economists refer to as the area of increasing marginal costs or diminishing marginal returns. Now, in the presence of fixed costs, that marginal cost curve, which we still see here, will actually lead to eventually increasing average costs. So we've got a second curve here, the average cost curve, and we can see that for a while the diminishing marginal costs or decreasing marginal costs lead to a reduction in the average cost, but then eventually as the marginal costs increase, over in the right-hand side of the graph, the average cost eventually catches up and starts to increase as well. This is why when negotiating contracts, you must know exactly where on this curve your firm is operating. Actually, even though economists like to talk about being over on the right-hand side, for most firms, in just a practical matter, most firms find themselves over on that right-hand side of the curve where they're actually in a diminishing increasing productivity or declining marginal costs. For the practical matter, actually, that's where a lot of firms find themselves to be. Now, break-even analysis with increasing marginal costs is fairly difficult. I'd like to talk about a historical example, and this is the example, or actually the real-life story of Akio Morita and the Sony transistor radio that he developed in Japan and brought to America. In late 60s, Morita brought his radio to New York City, and he knew that the radio would cost more to produce if he had to go above his target output of 10,000 units. He'd negotiated some production facilities, had lined those up, knew he could pretty profitably produce or pretty economically produce 10,000 units. In fact, he could produce 5,000 units at a cost of about $20 per radio. If he increased to 10,000 units, he could produce those at a price of $15 each, but he knew that if he went above that, say 100,000 units, it was going to cost him a lot more. Now, he received actually an offer from a very large supplier in New York City, and the supplier requested 100,000 units. But Morita declined the offer, and the reason he declined was he knew that taking production to that level, the 100,000 units, would put him way into the increasing marginal cost section of his production curve. He knew what his curve looked like. He knew what that low water point was. He knew it was about 10,000 units, and in fact, that was what he eventually negotiated with the supplier, was that he would produce 10,000 units of the Sony transistor radio, and the rest is history. I'd like to talk a little bit about the terms fixity and flexibility. When economists talk about economies of scale, they sometimes talk about fixity and flexibility. Factors that are fixed in the short run, or fixed costs in the short run, may become variable in the long run. A one-year renewable lease would be an example of a cost that over that one-year period really can't be changed, but over a longer period of time, leases can be renegotiated, and what may be fixed in the short run may become flexible or more variable in the long run. And so anytime we're thinking about costs and production scales, it's important to keep in mind or differentiate between both the short run and the long run. Those are very, very vague terms that economists use simply to define in the short run, a period of time over which you've got certain fixed costs or you're locked into certain things, and the long run would be a longer period of time, very context specific, over which some of those costs might be renegotiated. Long run average costs are constant. If they're constant with respect to output, then you have constant returns to scale. If long run average costs rise with output, again, just to reiterate, this is a situation that we will describe as decreasing returns to scale or diseconomies of scale. And if average costs fall with the level of output, then we're in a period or a section of that cost curve that economists refer to as one of increasing returns to scale or economies of scale. Now, this has very practical implications. If we think about large, big box or category killer stores like Home Depot or Walmart or Staples, they have suppliers, and those suppliers typically enjoy economies of scale, meaning if the supplier can increase production, they're going to be able to do that at a lower per unit or marginal cost. These suppliers compete oftentimes in very, very competitive environment to get shelf space at Walmart or Home Depot for the right to supply those superstores. And in return, the benefit is if they get on the shelf, they get all of that big box store's demand at all of the stores. In this context, it's in the interest of the big box store to anticipate this, even know a little bit about the cost structure of their suppliers, and offer contracts that enable that supplier to move as far as possible down the cost curve and realize as many of those economies of scale as possible. The price point then that's negotiated is one that, to some degree, passes on the benefit of those economies of scale to the consumers of the big box store. Learning curves describe production in large and complex situations. A classic example is the manufacture of a new airplane model. Let's suppose that every time an airline doubles its production, its costs go down, or marginal costs go down, by 20%. Now, while it's clear that in these kinds of examples the costs decrease as output increases, it's not at all clear which transaction party, the airline or the consumer the customer buying the airplanes will benefit. Nor is it clear really whether the first customer, if they buy in at a higher price and pay a higher average price for the airplanes, are they simply passing on those savings to their competitors who may come later and be able to purchase the airplanes at a lower price? All of these are relevant considerations. And all of these are going to boil down to certain types of contracts or negotiating practices that the customers and the suppliers or the firm enter into. But if we look for now or for a moment at the underlying economics of how we model a cost learning curve scenario, let's suppose that the cost of building the first airplane is $100 million. And again, going back to the assumption, let's assume that the cost of production drops by 20% every time production doubles. So if we double from 1 to 2, our cost goes down 20%, from $100 to $80 million. From 2 to 4 is another doubling, and again, 20% off of 80 million takes us down to 64. And I've just used a little bit of a log scale to kind of smooth or interpolate the numbers in between the doubling points. So we double from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, and so on. And then we've kind of, I've just smoothed those numbers using a log scale in between. The first column has the quantity, the second column has the marginal cost. The third column is the total cost, and that is simply equal to, for one plane, $100 million. If we produce a second plane at $80 million, the total production cost will be 100 plus 80, or 180. If we produce 3 planes, the total production costs are 100 plus 80 plus 70.2, which gives us a total cost of $250.2 million. It's very important to just be able to calculate these total costs from the marginal costs and be sure that you're able to do that. Once you've filled in the total cost column, we can calculate the average cost per airplane, which at any row is simply equal to the total cost divided by the number of airplanes. And what we see here is that as the marginal cost goes down, so too does the average cost decline. In this case, the average cost, illustrated in red, is a little bit higher than the marginal cost simply because it captures or incorporates or includes all of the historical costs of the first, second, third, fourth, and so on airplane. The marginal cost, remember, is just the cost of each incremental airplane, so it's a little bit lower. We see that both are going down. If you're producing or working with a product that has a market characterized by learning curves, it's extremely important to understand the rate at which the price improvement occurs, and then to factor that information and factor that knowledge into the price negotiation decision that may occur up front. Thanks for listening.